Well, first of all, it's great to be back at TTR because this was my favourite event always, and I wasn't able to get here for a few years, and so I'm back, and it's been great so far. It's only the second day, and I've met so many great people, and it's really good to be back. Now, some of you know me already. Those who don't, I sound a little different because I'm from Australia. So I've got two questions for you. First, can you all hear me? Yes. And the second one, can you understand me? Yeah. Well, that's probably the most important part. So what I'm going to talk about today is Luke Short killing Charlie Storms, as we got here. Death in the dust. And that's exactly what it was. So Luke Short killed Charlie Storms on February 25th, 1881 on Allen Street in front of the Oriental Saloon. And it was a one-on-one gunfight. But it was only one event in a series of ongoing confrontations between gamblers struggling to control a lion's share of the Pharaoh dollar in Tombstone. So these confrontations were happening in other saloons as well, but this particular one started in the Oriental. So there were two main factions involved in the confrontations, and there were the Slopers. One, they hailed from west of the Pacific Slope, namely San Francisco, the California Goldfields, Nevada Comstock. And the second faction was the Easterners, and they were predominantly from Kansas, Colorado, and other states east of the slope. So Pharaoh was the game that they were all trying to dominate because it was the major card game played across the frontier in the late 19th century. So poker, you'll always see poker in TV shows and movies, but poker was around, but Pharaoh was the main game that everybody played. It was the everyday man's game. It was simple, it was easy to play. You could bet in Tombstone, you could bet with as low as a 10-cent check or chip. So anybody could get involved, all the way from minors way up to the high rollers. And the odds were not heavily in favour of the house, unlike many games today. So it was popular for those reasons. And I say the odds weren't heavily in favour of the house. That's in a fair game. A lot of games weren't so fair. But Pharaoh was a dangerous occupation and pastime because a man could lose not only his money and his reputation, but he could lose his life. And that's because players sat very close together, and the combination of alcohol, the anger at losing, it could lead to accusations of cheating, insults and fights. And you can see here this Pharaoh game. I've got it labelled as Nevada. In my notes I had it labelled as Nevada, but Chuck Smith is telling me that he's seen it labelled as Morenci, Arizona. So that's even better if it's Arizona. I believe it's later. It's like it's not 1880s, but the game is still the same. So on the far right there, you can see the guy with the white hat and the white shirt. He's the dealer. There's a man obscured to his right who is the lookout, and he's employed to watch for cheating by the players. The guy facing us is a player. The man with the top hat on there, sitting there, is the casekeeper who would keep track of what cards have been played. And the man closest to us there on the left is a player. So you can see how closely they're all seated together, and it was very easy for someone to pull a knife and stab the dealer or stab the guy next to him. So, and there was alcohol involved, and one thing could lead to another very quickly, and often did. And you can see those stacks of what we call now chips on the board. They were called checks back in the old days, not chips. So as I'm going through this, if you hear me refer to checks, it's actually a betting chip. So we'll talk about the shooting and the shooters. So firstly, the location. The location, the problem started inside the Oriental, but they ended up outside on Allen Street. So the Oriental is owned by Milt Joyce, and Milt was a tough Irishman. He'd been a blacksmith. He was a savvy businessman. He became a politician. He was nowhere near the man that was portrayed in the Tombstone movie, which didn't do him justice at all. So Milt was tough, and you didn't want to mess with Milt. But Milt owned the Oriental, but he was smart enough to lease the gambling rooms to Lou Rickabar as of October 1st, 1880. And I say he was smart enough because he would be receiving the lease money from Rickabar, and he didn't have to bear the risk of losing money on the table. So Rickabar, then being the owner or the runner of the gambling rooms, he was the one who took all the risk. And as I said before, you could bet as low as 10 cents, or on some tables, high rollers are betting in the thousands. So Lou was smart enough too to know that he would need some partners because cash was king, and the house could have a bad night too, just as well as a gambler. So Lou ends up taking on two money men, two partners. This is later. I don't know exactly when these guys became partners, but you got Dick Clark on the left and William Harris on the right. Harris is famous from Dodge City. Unfortunately, I have no photo of Lou Rickabar. I'm sorry. No one's ever found one. Mike Mihalovich and I have been trying to locate some stuff on Lou Rickabar, and we haven't been able to come up with a photo yet. So the Oriental gambling rooms were also different because they were very elegant, and they were fitted with the best carpet, fixtures, furniture, and it was the envy of all the other Tombstone saloons, and it attracted a lot of gamblers and drinkers alike. So not only were the gamblers vying for the money, but obviously the saloons are trying to get you to come to their saloon as opposed to somebody else's saloon. The Alhambra was the big competition for the Oriental. And that's where Doc Holliday ends up dealing faro at the Alhambra. He wasn't working at the Oriental. So we get to the shooters. So I just put this up to show you the basic difference between Storms and Short. And I don't know if you can read it, but Storms is age 60. He's from New York via California. He's a professional gambler by trade, he's a sloper, and he's an old grey-bearded son of a bitch. And we know that because that's what Luke Short apparently called him. As for Short, you can see he's only age 27, he's from Arkansas via Colorado. Professional gambler, he's an Easterner. And we know what we know about him is he was short in name and also short in stature. He's only about 5'5", so that's just a snapshot of the two guys, and you can see the differences. So, you know, one's twice the age and experience of the other. They've come from different parts of the country. In fact, you couldn't probably get two more opposite men, really. So Charlie Storms was a 60-year-old veteran gambler of the California Gold Rush. He had first run a saloon in the gold fields as early as 1852, and he was said by some newspapers to have been born in New Orleans. However, Storms always claimed he was from New York, or he's born in New York. Newspapers claim he ran into some trouble, serious trouble in New York, and then he relocated to the West Coast during the California Gold Rush. Storms then moved from the gold fields to Sacramento and eventually to the faro dens of the Barbary Coast in San Francisco. And it was there that he met and formed a successful gambling partnership with a tough Irish immigrant named Henry Lyons. Now, I want to mention Henry Lyons because he was Storms' partner, and they travelled together. They went to just about every boom town on the frontier. So, and Lyons does play a minor role in the proceedings, so I want to include him. And he was known he was Irish, so he's known to his friends and enemies as Dublin. That was his nickname. So you often, in the newspapers, you often saw him referred to as Dublin Lions or just Dublin. People knew. He was 46 years old when he came to Tombstone, and although he was 14 years younger than Storms, the two men formed a solid friendship and business partnership, and it took them all over the frontier. So they were in Deadwood, they were in Virginia City, they were in Cheyenne, they were in a lot of the towns in Nevada, they were in Pioche, they were in Virginia City, they were in Sacramento, they were in San Francisco. So they were well known as a dynamic duo. And they were both known as nervy gamblers, and what that means, it had two meanings, nervy. Nervy meant that you could bet high and hold your nerve, and it also meant that if somebody came at you or you wanted to go at someone, you wouldn't hesitate. So you were nervy at the table when you were betting big, and then if you had to defend yourself, you could. You'd pull gun or knife quite easily. So if you hear someone described with that term nervy, that's what it means. It means they didn't hesitate, really. So both of them would resort to gunplay in tight situations. So Storms was rumoured to have killed 3 men during his long career, but unfortunately that was in his obituary, but the exact details are lacking. His most celebrated gunfight was in Deadwood in 1876, and he shot it out with a guy named Johnny Varnes in the middle of a Deadwood street. They both emptied their pistols at each other from across the street, and neither hit anything but wagons and buildings. But they stood their ground and emptied their guns. And Lyons in 1877, Dublin Lyons exchanged gunshots with a gambler named Tom Mulqueen, and that was over a disputed faro bet. Tom Mulqueen shot Lyons in the shoulder, but Lyons, even though he was shot, he managed to return fire before both men were disarmed. So these guys were experienced, and nothing seemed to faze them. So both Storms and Lyons are what I call hardcore slopers, because their base was San Francisco or Sacramento. They'd lived at least 20 years in that environment. So there's no verified photos of Charlie Storms, unfortunately, or Henry Lyons that I've located to date, and that's despite what you might see over at the Gunfighter Museum here in town. They have a ridiculous photo labelled as Charlie Storms, which is not Charlie Storms, but anyway, so if you go through that museum, just bear that in mind. I think they still have the wrong photo of Texas Jack Vermillion as well, which is disappointing, but anyway. Now, Luke Short, born in Arkansas, he was only 26 years old when he arrived in Tombstone, but he was 27 when the gunfight happened. He was hired by Lou Rickabar to protect the games at the Oriental, and he became a faro dealer and a lookout at the gambling rooms. So there's no substantiated records of Short having engaged in any gunfights prior to Tombstone. Bat Masterson claimed that Short had been involved in some trouble in Colorado prior to Arizona, but I've never been able to find anything to back that up. No newspapers, no records, so we're relying on Bat for that. But Short is in the census in 1880 in Colorado, but he doesn't come direct from Colorado to Arizona. He actually goes to Kansas City after the census around June in Colorado. He arrives in Kansas City around October, and he's immediately arrested for swindling a Texas cattleman using 3-card Monte, which was a typical con game that all gamblers seem to resort to at some stage. If they were low on cash, they'd get a sucker and play 3-card Monte and swindle them. So Short wasn't a clean skin. He was arrested, and he was eventually released on bail, but bail in those days often just meant a bribe to get yourself out of jail. And Short was told to get the hell out of Kansas City, and he did, and he came to Tombstone. So you got the scene set. You got Luke Short working for the Rickabar connection at the Oriental. You've got Bat Masterson arriving, I think, February 1881, so he's a new arrival. He goes straight to work at the Oriental. So you got the Earp brothers are aligned with Rickabar, and they're Easterners. So you got all the Easterners are basically at the Oriental, and it's the richest game in town. It's the nicest place in town. At that point, the stage is set for Storms and Lions to make their appearance in Tombstone. There is another guy in Tombstone already. He's been already here for about 6-7 months, and his name's Johnny Tyler. And again, he's a sloper, a tough sloper. He's 40 years of old. He's 40 years of age, 40 years old, and again, he's older than all these other guys that they're running into at the Oriental. So Masterson's young, Short's young, the Earp brothers are all younger than these guys. Tyler is nothing like he's portrayed in the Tombstone movie yet again. He's shortchanged. He's made as a stooge for Wyatt Earp to look great in that movie, but Tyler was tough. He was nervy. He already had a Pharaoh bank running at Danner and Owens Hall, so he had his foot in the door, so to speak. He had his own one Pharaoh bank running. Now, he knew Storms and Lions, so he may well have contacted them to say, hey, there's opportunity here, or like Rickabar, Tyler may have needed some partners, some cash, because like I said, it was a high-risk game, and you didn't want to go broke. So I can't prove it, but the timing suggests to me that Storms and Lions actually departed Denver in February 1881, maybe at the request of Tyler to say, come here, because they did know each other. They did come here with the intention of setting up one or more Pharaoh banks, and we know that because Lions told his friends later in San Francisco that they were there to set up a gambling business and to compete with the existing play. So upon arrival in Tombstone during the second week of February, the two men took up residence at the San Jose house on Fremont Street, which is just up here, short walk. It's still there, still labelled as the San Jose house, still in the same place. And you can see how close it is to the Oriental, just a short walk to Allen Street. So the build up to the fight. So we've got the scene set, everybody's here. So what's interesting to me is the first thing that the Storms and Lions used to do when they arrived in a new town, they would go and check out the place. They'd spend a couple of days looking at the competition, looking at which were the richest games, which were the poorest games, who was in charge of what. They'd suss the place out. And once they decided which place they wanted to hit, they would go in hard at that game. Being professional gamblers, they'd go to the richest, normally the richest place in town, and they'd try and break the bank. Now, that always didn't work, but as a duo, they could bet in tandem, and I'll explain a little bit about Pharaoh later if we have time, but I do have a whole chapter of it in this biography of Johnny Tyler, so if you don't know anything about Pharaoh, you can learn a bit about it in that book. So they've only been in town a few days. Charlie Storms goes looking for trouble, specifically at the Oriental Saloon. So he's dressed in a light summer suit. He's got a silk handkerchief in his left breast pocket, and that becomes important later on. And he's got a concealed pistol in his coat. And he proceeds to drink himself in a nasty state. Now, he was either a guy on the edge trying to numb his nerves or a guy convinced of his own abilities, and he thought he could take any man at the Oriental. I'm still not sure which one that was. I think maybe drinking was just a part of his lifestyle, but this time he was drinking heavy. So in the early hours of Friday morning, February 25th, he made his way to the Oriental. Dublin Lions is not with him, and I don't understand why he's not with him. He may have been asleep, or he may have been checking out another gambling place or hitting another gambling place, maybe even the Alhambra, because that was the second to the Oriental in terms of high stakes. But it's hard to understand why Storms would not take his partner with him when he's in that mood and going to the Oriental. Anyway, he does. And I think it's a pretty bold play because he's aging. He's twice as old as probably anybody else. the old grey-haired son of a bitch, trying to convince himself and others that maybe he still had what it took. So he's full of booze, he's full of bluster, and he proceeds to the Pharaoh table, and he sits down and he starts abusing the patrons. Now that's not a good idea, but then he starts abusing Lou Rickabar, the owner of the place. That's a bad idea. So he's intent on making a spectacle and causing trouble. So according to a later report, Rickabar, using his brains again, he could see the matter escalating, and he thought it was a one-on-one between him and Storm. So Rickabar got the hell out of there. He excused himself, slipped out a side door, and Luke Short takes over the table. So now you got Short dealing to Storms. So Storms immediately then turns his attention to Luke Short. So until, oh, and by the way, that is typical Sloper tactic in terms of trying to intimidate the dealer. It happened a lot in San Francisco. If you could put the dealer off his game, you had a better chance of winning. So it was quite common for players to abuse the dealer in the hope that the dealer would lose his nerve or make a mistake or whatever, and you'd win. So until 2016, most accounts of what happened next relied on Bat Masterson, who claimed he was present for the entire affair. And also Tombstone resident and diarist George Parsons, who arrived on the scene after the fact. So Parsons arrives after the fact and writes something in his diary, not too much. Bat Masterson went into some detail about it, but that's all we had. So Luke Short's version of the events had never been fully examined because the coronial inquest file that you would expect to find at the archives or wherever has never been located. So someone either stole it or it got destroyed or it's missing. The Daily Nugget apparently carried the full coroner's report, but unfortunately the Daily Nugget's missing as well. So not just that issue, but entire months of the Nugget are missing for early 1881, which is a real sad state of affairs for researchers because the Nugget, as its name, it was gold. I mean, it carried so many great reports, and it carried the coroner's report. But I did discover a transcript of Luke Short's coronial testimony. So it was reported in the Daily Nugget, but the Nugget's missing. The Deadwood Pioneer, 2 weeks after the event, it must have received the Nugget in the mail, and it picked up and reprinted 2 weeks later in the Deadwood Pioneer, Luke Short's full testimony. So I often say to people, if you can't find what you're looking for in the town that it happened, it's good advice to look in another town where your subject may have lived prior, because those towns kept an interest in the people that used to live in those towns. So the reason they reprinted the Luke Short's testimony was because Storms was well known in Deadwood, and they knew that it would interest the people in Deadwood if they reported on Charlie Storms getting killed. So my advice to people is always, sometimes you find nuggets in other areas. San Francisco newspapers used to pick up reports as well. So if you don't find what you're looking for in the place that it happened, look another place where that man or woman may have lived prior. So I was lucky enough to find the report in the newspaper during my research in 2015 into the shooting. And it's clear from the testimony the inquest was conducted immediately, so the day after the shooting, they're right onto it. So at this point, you're going to need to use your imagination a bit, because you're going to have to pretend that I'm 5'5", that I'm 27, and that I'm from Arkansas. So this is how Luke testified. My name is Luke Short, 27 years of age, born in Arkansas, resided in Tombstone 2 or 3 months. I'm a speculator. Now, no one puts down that they're a gambler in all the records. Rickabar puts down he's a speculator. Short says he's a speculator. It was a common term for a gambler, but nobody wanted to write gambler, so they'd write speculator. So then he goes on to say, the first occurrence was yesterday morning. I went to work at the Oriental. Storms came in there and began playing against the game. He mentioned about fighting. He said that he could look anybody in the house. Then he said he would like to be a peon for some son of a bitch, and he looked at me. I told him, stop. Here some words followed that I do not remember exactly. Now he's being cagey here because the Cheyenne Sun picked up the story also from the Nugget, and there on record as quoting that Luke Short called Charlie Storms an old grey-bearded son of a bitch. We don't know exactly what Storms called Short. So the testimony continues. He asked me to go out into the street and fight him. He said he would give me the first shot. He had about $75 worth of checks before him at the time, and he said he would bet all of them to a quarter of $1, that he could lick me and give me the first shot. I told him no, I did not want to fight, but I did not want to be insulted anymore by him. He then said, to show you that I'm a fighter, I will make a present of all these checks to you if you'll go out and fight me. I will not make any play at you, I will show you that I'm healed. And he pulls out a gun. I told him to be careful how he handled it. He then asked if I would go out in the backyard and have a civil talk. I told him that I would, and I went out with him. When we got there, he said it was all a mistake. He did not want to insult me. It was for a different party altogether. Now that's hard to believe when you're sitting face to face. I told him it was a very gross insult. Now we don't know what the insult was, but apparently it was gross. But if it wasn't meant for me, we would drop it and be friends, to which we both agreed. I went back inside and went to work. Storms went to playing against another game in the same house. So Storms is still in the Oriental, but he's at a different Pharaoh table. Now, my research shows Rickabar was running at least 3 Pharaoh tables. And I think the reason for that, he's trying to cater to all types, the low roller, the high roller, and the in-between. But there's 3 tables, so at least. So Short is still dealing at his table. Storms has gone, and this is the part that gets me, he's drunk, he's armed, we know he's armed, and they've let him sit down at another table. Crazy, in light of Mike's talk about the Ordnance Night. Get this, shortly after, he bought a bottle of wine and called me to drink with him, which I did. I thought it was all settled. And that, to me, that's interesting too, because in all the Westerns I've watched, they drink shots of whiskey or beer. Nobody's drinking wine. No one, Wyatt doesn't go up to the bar and say, give me a glass of wine. But Storms has bought a bottle of wine. So not only is he's armed, he's already drunk, they've sold him a bottle of wine. Asking for trouble, right? So Short then says, I came off watch about 1 o'clock, not thinking any more about it. So then he continues on, Mr. Rickabar and Mr. Masterson told me to look out for myself, that Storms was making threats against me and he threatened to kill me. So I intended to go back to speak to Storms, but he was still drinking and I thought, I better wait till he gets sober. So at this point, well, there's Luke, looking young and 27. I want to just talk about the partisan observers. So again, you got, at this point, Masterson and Lyons are actually there now. They've been mentioned for the first time by Luke Short at this point. And again, you see that Lyons is 46. He's from Ireland via California. He's a professional gambler. He's a sloper. And that Masterson is 27. So again, you got this 20-year age gap. So Lyons has got like 20 years experience on Masterson. Masterson's from Canada via Kansas, and he's a professional gambler and he's an Easterner. So Short continues. Myself, Mr. Masterson and Mr. Lyons, Storms' partner called Dublin, were standing talking on the platform in front of the Oriental. Storms came out of the Oriental and caught me by the coat lapel and said, I want to see you. And we walked probably 10 feet. He stepped firm. He was a little ahead of me. He then turned around and said, you called me an old son of a bitch. And I said, I don't remember the exact words I used, but I said, did we not agree to settle it? He made no reply to that, but said, you called me a son of a bitch, and I want to know if you are as good a man as you were then. I hesitated a little. Before I had time to answer, he said, you son of a bitch, and then he grabbed his gun. As soon as he did this, I grabbed my gun and we both went to work. I thought we both fired at the same time. I can't tell exactly, as I was excited when he called me away from Mr. Double and his partner. The position that Storms stopped in placed me between the two with my back to Dublin. So at this point I think Storms is out in the middle of the street, Short is off the sidewalk and he's facing Storms and he's got Masterson and Dublin behind him on the boardwalk still. After the first shots were fired, I made a circle back to get away from Dublin to protect myself against Dublin or whoever was behind me. I saw that Storms was falling back, took my eye off him and looked the other way. When I looked back, Storms was nearly on his back, but he had his head and shoulders up. When I looked the other way, I saw everyone was gone. They bet you they were gone because they didn't want to get shot. I looked back and I saw Storms. He was laying on his back with his head and shoulders up off the ground, his pistol in both hands. His eyes were following me in a direction I was taking. I tried to get to one side. I think he means he turned side on. He had his 6-shooter leveled at me and I expected he would shoot. I dropped on my knees, which is a pretty smart thing to do. So he's turned side on, dropped to his knees, and I fired at him. Don't know whether I hit him or not. Immediately after I fired the last time, his hands and gun seemed to fall on his breast. The reason that Storms fell backwards because Short's very first shot hits him right in the breast and he goes down straight away. But he's still got enough blood pumping that he's able to bring his back and head up and hold his gun in two hands and try again for Storms, but the shot goes wild. So Bat Masterson claimed later, so we'll leave the testimony there for the moment. So Bat Masterson claimed later that he intervened to stop a gunfight between Short and Storms. So this is in the Masterson version that we all knew of. He claims he did that during their first verbal argument in the Oriental, yet Short, he doesn't mention Masterson in that part of his testimony. Short stated that he himself calmed Storms during their sojourn in the backyard in the early hours. Masters is only mentioned later in the day when he warned Short of the subsequent threats. So we've got these two versions. In Masterson's version, he claims to have escorted Storms back to his room at the San Jose house to sleep off his drunkenness. Masterson later returns to the Oriental only to see Storms reappear and re-enter the place again hunting for Short. So for his part, Short was presumably on a break, maybe resting, eating. He's making his way back to do an afternoon shift at the Oriental when Storms comes straight out of the Oriental and grabs him by the coat lapel. This time Storms' partner Dublin is with him, as we know, because Luke testified, but he waited outside. So when Storms goes in hunting for Short the second time, Lyons is there, but he doesn't try to stop him. He doesn't try to help him, which I find odd too. He must have just thought that Storms was going to get the better of Short. He must have thought, my man will take him out easy, I don't have to do anything, but watch. Well, he was badly mistaken. So for his part, Masterson may well have escorted Storms back to the San Jose house without Short knowing, because Short's on a break. So Masterson also claimed that he was a good friend to Short and Storms prior to the gunfight, but that statement, like many others, is hard to validate. So another eyewitness to the shooting was the gunshot surgeon, George Goodfellow. Well, there's Bat, and there's George. So he made the following observations about the shooting in a medical paper he wrote, and this part is interesting and it refers to the silk handkerchief that he had in his left breast pocket. I was a few feet distant, so this is George now writing an article years later about the effect of bullets on silk fabric. So I was a few feet distance from a couple of individuals who were quarrelling. They began shooting. The first shot took effect, as was afterwards ascertained in the left breast by one of them, Storms, who after being shot and while staggering back some 12 feet cocked and fired his pistol twice, his second shot going into the air. For by that time he was on his back. He never made any motion after pulling the trigger the second time, the pistol dropping to the ground with his hands. So that matches exactly what Luke Short testified to. It's almost identical. So Goodfellow estimated that Short actually shot Charlie Storms from a distance of only 6 feet, which is probably why he hit him first go, and stated that Short's weapon on the day was a cut-off Colt .45 caliber. So these aren't the weapons obviously, but just to give you an idea of what they might have looked like. So Short's weapon is on the right, a cut-off Colt .45, and we know through Stuart Lake, Wyatt's biographer, he mentioned in his notes that Storms was using a Smith & Wesson .44 caliber short barreled, which looks something like the one there on the left. So once the shooting had finished, Short continued, I'll continue his testimony here. I then stepped back off the porch and looked around for a moment when a policeman ran up to me and said, "Give me a gun." I told him, "All right," but that I did want protection. About this time, Mr. Earp got there and he said, "This is my prisoner." I said, "All right, take my gun, that's all I know." So Short was clearly worried that he was going to get shot by Dublin Lions or maybe even Johnny Tyler, who may have been around as well. So he said, "I want protection." So he knew that he was in danger. And Earp, he calls him Mr. Earp, takes him as a prisoner. So Short refers to a policeman without providing the name, indicating he may not have known the officer. And then he goes on to refer to Mr. Earp, placing him in protective custody. So Short was fearing, as I said, that he was going to get backshot. The Cheyenne Daily Sun noted that Short was arrested by an officer and then immediately turned over to a US Marshal. So I'm thinking that Mr. Earp was Virgil Earp because he was a deputy US Marshal at the time. So Wyatt Earp was also on the scene, and he later said that he helped actually carry the body of Charlie Storms back to the San Jose house where Lyons and he had been staying, so that a post-mortem could be performed by Goodfellow. And the tension must have been high because Lyons did not want that procedure to take place. And again, from Stuart Lake's notes, Wyatt's biographer, Lake jotted in his notes that Dublin Lyons, Storms' partner, tried to stop the post-mortem, unquote. So Lyons was unsuccessful, probably because Earp was there. The post-mortem went ahead, was carried out by Goodfellow, and that's where Goodfellow noted that the bullet went straight in through the silk handkerchief, or in with the silk handkerchief. So this is Goodfellow saying, "Half an hour afterwards, I made an examination of the body. Upon stripping it, I found not one drop of blood come from either of the two wounds. From the wound in the breast, a silk handkerchief protruded, which I presumed had been stuffed in by some friends to prevent the bleeding. I withdrew it, and with it came the bullet." So the silk had actually gone in with the bullet, but hadn't been broken. So it was then seen to have been carried by the ball. Upon opening the body, the track of the ball was found to be as follows: through the left ventricle, through the descending aorta, and then through the body into the second and third dorsal vertebrae. Gee, that's hard to... I wince when I read it. Into the spinal canal, fracturing the laminae. So, no wonder Storms fell over. Bullet's gone through his heart, then into his spine. And Goodfellow says the ball came from a cut-off Colt .45 caliber. And I think the TTR or the FOT actually did an examination of that. We got a pig's carcass covered in silk and we fired shots into it. I don't know when the year was, but some of you may have been here for that. So the coroner found that Storms had been killed, obviously, by Luke Short. There was a brief preliminary hearing held into the killing conducted by Albert O. Wallace, who we heard about last night. The hearing appears to have taken place the day after the shooting. Short's lawyer was William Hunsiker, who represented him during the hearing, and the case was promptly dismissed. There was no murder. It was obviously self-defence. So Storms was buried in Boot Hill. He'd apparently been a busy guy in his private life because he left one widow named Mary in San Francisco, and he left a second widow named Nellie, who was a prostitute in Leadville, Colorado. Now, Mary Storms, I presume, was his main woman. She later had Storms' body exhumed and transported back to San Francisco for reburial. So the undertakers here, Ritter and Ream, conducted the exhumation and arranged for the transport on her behalf with the assistance of the IOOF fraternity. So Storms is not actually buried in Boot Hill. His marker is there, but his body's not. His body is actually back in San Francisco. Dublin Lions return to the Oriental. Get this, 2 nights, so this is 2 nights later after the coroner's inquest and after Short's been exonerated. Dublin Lions is dumb enough to go back to the Oriental, intent on causing more trouble. But he's completely outnumbered, he's out of his depth. He gets pistol whipped by Lou Rickabar, and then he gets manhandled by Wyatt Earp, who warns him to leave Tombstone. And at this point, Lyons suddenly is smart enough to move to Tucson to recover from the beating that he'd taken. And he eventually moves back to San Francisco, where he tells a very biased report. Milt Joyce had had enough of the violence, so everything went bad from this point on for the Easterners, because Milt Joyce had had enough of the violence in his saloon. He closes the entire saloon, he cancels Lou Rickabar's lease on the gambling rooms, and he closes the Oriental for the entire month of March. And when he reopens, it's not with Rickabar. He sacked Rickabar, he's torn up the lease, he gets new dealers in from Prescott to be in charge of the gambling lease. So it turned out pretty badly for all concerned, really. There were no winners out of that. Luke Short remained in Tombstone to be cleared by the grand jury, and he left Arizona early May 1881, heading for Dodge City, Kansas. And he may have been relatively unknown when he arrived in Tombstone, but he sure had a reputation when he left. And that's the end of that. And if you want to know more on the Gamblers' War, or Johnny Tyler, the Slopers, the Easterners, it's all in this book, Johnny Tyler, Story of Johnny Tyler and Tombstone's Gamblers' War. So thank you very much.